So, this is a brief discussion about clothing our extended skin, a short chapter from McLuhan's book, Understanding Media. And there's just a couple of quotes here. And what McLuhan is doing is looking at clothing as a particular medium that extends our body, it extends our skin. And, it, like for our ancient ancestors, you could think of, people walking around forests in bear skins or pelts or furs or something like that. I mean, really, I think like Wisconsin was sort of founded because they all the beaver and deer and bear um, and various animals that they killed and made into clothing and shipped back to Europe. Uh, so there's what McLuhan says. He says, economists have estimated that an unclad society eats 40% more than one in Western attire. Clothing as an extension of our skin helps to store and to channel energy, so that if the Westerner needs less food, he may also demand more sex. Yet neither clothing nor sex can be understood as separate, isolated factors, and many sociologists have noted that sex can become a compensation for crowded living. I'm not going to touch that sex stuff, but there's something to be said in our sort of our ancient ancestors, the idea of the calorie or the unit of energy that you could get by food, and food was scarce often enough, particularly for hunter-gatherers, for nomadic groups. And, until we really established sort of agriculture and city states in the Neolithic age, which would be like, 10,000 years ago, the sort of founding of farms and stuff, where we no longer wandered. Um, the kind of clothing and the energy moderation was very, very significant. McLuhan continues, he says, privacy, like individualism, is unknown in tribal societies, a fact that Westerners need to keep in mind when estimating the attractions of our way of life to non-literate peoples. So the non-literate peoples he's referring to would be like village culture, who still live in sort of collectivistic traditional mores, and those kind of customs and habits, those that sort of social morality wouldn't make sense, right, in sort of a contrast to a Western individualism, which stresses being alone. And like we have walls, it's not just privacy in terms of clothing, but we value privacy and independence in ways these village cultures would not. Second quote, clothing as an extension of the skin can be seen both as a heat control mechanism and as a means of denning the self socially. In these respects, clothing and housing are near twins, though clothing is near and elder. For housing extends the inner heat control mechanisms of our organism, while clothing is a more direct extension of the outer surface of the body. And he's saying a lot here. I mean, that first he's creating this relation between clothing and housing, right? Because both are energy control mechanisms. I mean, I've seen really interesting things when I was in Salt Lake City for a conference in November. It's very cold outside, but there was a pretty sizable homeless population. And so what this guy did, how we have like heat warmers and body warmers and that kind of stuff you use when you're snowmobiling or skiing or something like that. He he had like 5 or 6 big ones, and he put them all over his body, and he was sleeping in a sleeping bag. I thought, that was both very sad and super interesting at the same time. And I had a conference in Baltimore, and there was a homeless guy, and this I think happens quite often. And he was like, it was very cold outside, but I don't know, the gases from the vents. Uh, put off energy, and so on the street he was kind of laying and sleeping on one of these vents. And so what am I trying to say? That Right. We have this sort of biological need for homeostasis in terms of energy. That is, it can't be too hot and it can't be too cold. And our body has to work. When we get out of that equilibrium, and there's this clear relation between clothing and housing in that respect. And, this idea of denning the self socially that he's talking about. Um, is the identity implicative nature of both our house and our clothing. That is, what is the house say about me, or my or my or the clothes you're wearing right now. What does that say about you? I mean, I'm asked probably fairly casual, right? You're probably wearing something like tennis shoes if you're wearing shoes. Um, Maybe sweats or something like that. I mean, I could be totally wrong. You could be watching this in a tuxedo, but that would be very strange. Like an evening gown, that'd be weird. McLuhan continues, he says, in the simplest terms, as already noted, housing is an effort to extend the body's heat control mechanism. Clothing tackles the problem more directly, but less fundamentally and privately rather than socially. Both clothing and housing store warmth and energy and make these readily accessible for the execution of many tasks otherwise impossible. In making heat and energy accessible socially to the family or the group, housing fosters new skills and new learning, performing the basic functions of all other media. Heat control is the key factor in housing as well as in clothing. And so, like this last part, right, in making heat and energy accessible socially to the family or the group, housing fosters new skills and new learning, performing the basic functions of all other media. What he is asserting this sort of the translatable property of all media. You can think of think of your cell phone, how it like gobbled up all kinds of other media. So your cell phone's not just a phone, obviously. Well, it's all kinds of crazy stuff. It's a flashlight. It's a stopwatch. It's an alarm clock. It's a camera. It's all this stuff. It's a GPS device. It's a compass. Yada yada yada. Right? It's this idea that like th- those functions in the house used to be separate. So think, for example, like gathering water, right? That used to be a kind of separate medium where you'd have to go do that, right? Or the washing your clothes, how that too, right? Or even cooking, right? But in the house, right, we have all of these media all sort of bundled in one, all bundled in one. And I mean, I think it's very difficult for us to imagine the sort of separated functions. I mean, like a really good example is, we're like maybe 2 or 3 generations removed from outhouses, right? I mean, it would have been seen as a sort of separate function, those sort of bodily excretory functions versus something like in the house, it just sort of pulls that medium in with all the other media, right? Um, and in the house itself, right? Because of that, it's this idea of sort of fostering new skills and new learning, all the various possibilities that you can develop around the house and because of the house. Um, be, right? You can be doing stuff 24/7.